Hello, and welcome back to Grand Rapids, to NPM and to Pray Tell blog. We have so many great panels going on during this conference, and a panel on English chant. So we'll be talking about how to adapt Latin chant into English, or whether to do so, and how to write easier English, some would call it plain song. I don't like the word plain song or plain chant. Did you know that? I'd like to think there's nothing plain about it, but be that as it may, English chant is our topic. And we have a great panel of people to talk about various examples of chant. So with us is, I'll start over there, Caleb Wenzel. He sang in the National Catholic Youth Choir, studied at St. John's undergrad, now studying sacred music, doctoral level at Notre Dame. Tim Dusenbury was on the staff of National Catholic Youth Choir last year. He did a degree in liturgical music in our Graduate School of Theology and studied composition with Robert LeBlanc, and now works in a parish in Virginia. Horst Buchholz is at the Cathedral Basilica in St. Louis as music director, and he's also with the CMAA. So a lot of chant background there, of course. Audrey Seah is another former student of mine. You three all sang in my chant schola, is that right? That was mostly Latin chant. Audrey is a doctoral theology at the University of Notre Dame. And then here, immediately to my left, is J. Michael Thompson. And Michael is a very renowned presenter and publisher and composer of Latin chant and hymn text writer. So if you're online, you will note that at the post there is also a PDF that has the chant examples that we're going to be looking at and discussing today. And what we want to do, we want to begin by listening to the first 3 pages of that PDF. The screen will also be going on. And I had Brother Elred Senna back at the monastery record these pieces so that we all could listen to them. Brother Elred is associate publisher with Give Us This Day from Liturgical Press. He's also sung in my Gregorian chant schola. So let's get right at it and start listening to Qui Man twice. We have 2 versions of notation for it, and then we will listen to an English adaptation of it by Father Samuel Weber.
Et bibit sanguinem meum in me manet, et ego in eo dicit Dominus. Qui manducat carnem meam, et bibit sanguinem meum, in me manet, et ego in eo dicit Dominus. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him, says the Lord. Alleluia.
Okay, and now we're back to discuss, and we're all smiling because here at NPM we hear this wonderful, it sounds like a very high quality grand piano. It's projecting very well, and we were hearing a little bit of my favorite things. I'm told by our sound tech person that online you are only hearing Latin chant. So should we begin by evaluating the Latin chant melody? Actually, I think it's perfect. It's amazing to me. Okay, so I have a bias on Latin chant. How mode 6 in the Latin chant has a simplicity about it, and yet it doesn't. You want to add to that?
Oh, add to that. I love this chant. It's one of my favorites, and the fact that it's also a communion, common communion, and usable for it. Yeah. I love the ending with that huge melisma, a melismatic phrase with a D-cheat. Says the Lord. Just, adds this huge sparkle to the entire piece, and it's a lovely way to just end it. The meum as well, and the meam. Just little parts like that that go on.
I think the antiphon in mode 6 is definitely one of the more intimate antiphons, and it is. If you think of how many communion antiphons, and there are not too many, that actually talk about the Eucharist, so the Qui Manducat certainly is a text that gives itself to maybe a slightly more intimate tone, I think, as the tone 6 is.
Struck the beautiful phrase et ego in eo. And especially the repercussion on the word "eo," I think, is so beautiful. Bring home the fact that it's him in us. I thought that was very, very wonderful, expressive.
Anyone else want to add anything? Because I wanted to talk about the D cheat that Audrey picked up, because I don't think you can chant. They put a lot of notes on the important words, and if there aren't a lot of notes, it's not important. I think there's some. However, I think there's something more on. I have the impression that, this is not a Karl Barth statement that God truly speaks, over against all human folly. Maybe it is that. I don't think it is. I think it's more syntactical, and I think it's a way of setting off the last section because it has a different kind of meaning compared to the rest of it, which is a quote. I find that fascinating, the way they do all of that.
Like the concept of Dici Dominus being quotation marks.
Yes.
In effect.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Good. So the panel thought that we were only here to evaluate English chant. You didn't know we were going to evaluate Latin, but it was fun to do so because I suspect that will raise all of the issues that I know you all have opinions about. Does it work to convey all of that in English? And if so, how do you do it? Do you just get out your whiteout and put your divinely inspired melody? Caleb is frowning. Something else that you do. So for that, let's turn to Father Samuel Weber, great apostle and evangelist of Latin chant. This is from his Proper of the Mass that Ignatius Press kindly gave us permission to reprint. So what do you think of what Father Samuel did with this piece? Comments on how it relates to the Latin melody and what you think works about it, or what you might have done differently?
Well, I think he tries in first antiphons, when we can look at the other ones a little bit later, to really keep as much of the splendor of that Gregorian melody intact as possible. Now, which words fall on which syllable and is the next question, is what of that splendor gets disturbed by simply the English grammar? Or do we sometimes need to find different translations where not that word but another word is on that melody? So those are a couple of questions we can certainly discuss as well.
So I have not ever heard of trying to find a different English word to fit the exact melody. So I would be very curious in looking over the English chant, Father Weber's English chant, his first antiphon. Were there other words, other substitutions that you thought of, Horst?
Ooh.
because to me, flesh is the first one that really, it doesn't seem like it would sing easy. But I'm wondering if when you were looking over this, you thought of any, were there any that came to mind?
No, you're asking the German to be the English wordsmith. That's not fair. But no, I'm just thinking. I mean, if we look even at the Graduale with the Eisel text, when those English antiphons are not the same as we have in the Missal now, so some of the words could be different. Now, what else could we say? Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood. Any suggestions? Or
When you have something that's out of the Gospels as opposed to being out of the Book of Psalms, much more restricted, I think. In your feeling of what tinker with. What would you substitute for the word flesh that wouldn't weaken the theology?
So it wouldn't be that this is the problem. We can't change the melody because we don't want to in principle. Change the text because it's from the Bible. So does that call into question the methodology of making a given text fit with a given melody?
It does to me. Yes, Caleb?
I would say that's exactly the problem or the trouble. I mean, when taking a Latin chant and trying to use the same melody for a different language, it's maybe not a problem as in like maybe we should never ever do this, but it does raise the question of what costs are we willing to spend on readapting this for a different language. So what melodic motifs are we willing to alter to help point out the punctuation marks in the text or the emphasis of a particular word in a phrase? How will we set off the quotation marks? I thought that was a fantastic way to consider this. Or what are we willing to change in the text? We're going to have to give somewhere in the adaptation process if you want the chant melody to be acceptable, I think.
For example, there was an Episcopalian adapter of chant, J. Mason Martins, and he would occasionally, I'm thinking of what he did with this antiphon, where it says in English, says the Lord. He would have put thus says, so that he could do da, da, that's on thus, and then the next one says. We don't have that kind of freedom. And of course, some people even find that artificial, but it shows in Latin you have two syllables, and in English you don't. And it's a short syllable at that.
Can I say this though? Just to be devil's advocate, I'll defend this because I know that there are concerns about whether the whole thing works, and you actually know that I share those concerns. But is it because we know the Latin and the Latin is so perfect that we're coming to this and we're comparing it? If we had never heard the Latin, if I just saw this and I thought, well, a composer wrote this melody because this is what the English text says to him. Okay, or Tim, do you think, well, no, my flesh feels lumpy just because it is lumpy, whether I had heard the Latin or not?
Yeah, I did think about that, and I thought just to look at the 5 notes of my flesh, when I was sort of singing that through in my mind, if I were just setting it in English, even if I were just using those notes, I think I would add one more F, and I would say, my flesh, something along those lines. But because we want to keep it, the words and the basic words, notes line up the same as in the Latin. There's that my flesh, which to me feels much more awkward to sing.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I suspect you wanted to do what the Latin though, and have the same melodic motive on flesh as on blood. And in Latin, it was a 5 cases. Could have done that.
As I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking a little bit, and this is hopefully not a tangent, of the fate of the Graduale simplex. Because what was the purpose of it was to keep some chant alive, but the people who thought they didn't like Latin would refuse that, and the people who loved the beauty of the Latin melodies, they said, it's all gone. So the Graduale simplex was a failure. I think that's.
3 of us use it. So.
Okay.
My efforts.
And the same thing happened, after the council, because we want to keep singing these Palestrina motets, and they try to put English words under them. But if you see the polyphony and its structure, it is not possible really to understand anything. So the English use of in Palestrina is futile. So here we have a situation. Okay, we have something in English, and we want to retain the beauty of the melody. Well, if we really want to have a chant sung, why don't we do it in Latin if we want to keep these Gregorian melodies?
Because you have an entire generation of people for whom it's deader than it was before. There are people in the congregation that I work in Pittsburgh, and they are very devout Catholics and they're very devout singers, but their reaction to Latin is, I know what I'm saying. I don't want to have it. I know you'll translate it for me, but I know what I'm saying myself. They just have, and they feel that way about other languages too, but there's no kind of, no, that's holy or that's old. It's like a stumbling block.
And I'm sensing some maybe Eastern Rite Catholicism coming in here. So for you, vernacular is not, a post-Vatican II liberal innovation. It's a part of the heritage.
No, but it's interesting that people who grew up with Slavonic liturgy rather than modern Slavic language or English had many people were going, I finally understand what I'm saying, and other people were going, oh, I don't like this. It doesn't fit the music. It had the same split.
I just want to jump back on this chant. I just taking off from what Father Anthony has said, if we look at this chant on its own, I think I would actually say it was well written. I enjoyed it. What I find interesting is the interpretation and the word accents. They're very different from what the Latin melody accents. So, for instance, in the chant, Carnem just has 2 punctums, 2 one-note neumes, but meam is really where you have the melismatic phrase. But over here you have it in flesh. So if you're singing my flesh is what's actually emphasized, and my blood is emphasized. And the same goes with the next phrase where it says, and I in him, I ends up being longer, while in the Latin I would go eo, and it seems to point towards the him a little bit more. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. It's like, when we recite poetry, people have different ways of maybe bringing out textual accents the way they think the poetry speaks more to them or whatever. But if I see this as a piece on its own, I would say it's successful. It's just hard for me to do that because I know the Latin so well, and I love the text painting that's happening in the Latin. And I'll admit to that.
Oftentimes in Latin, you look at it and you say to yourself, that meam and meum, is that just syntax? There, they're just rounding off the phrase. Or are they saying, yeah, but the syntax, I sure like the idea that it's my flesh and my blood. And oftentimes I think in Latin it seems like it's both, and they knew how to bring things together. So it's syntax and it's melody writing and it's the motives. It's also spirituality and theology. And I keep finding more and more things in there that I say, this is unbelievable. And I wonder, did they mean all of that? They never told us. We can only look at the melodies and the original neumes and guess. So is there a consensus on the English melody? It's doable, it works really well, or we're questioning the method in principle? Maybe we should leave it at that.
Well, I would say one thing, and this will be my last about. I think fitting English text to an existing melody, it has to be its own genre. Because just thinking about how Latin chant came to be, the music, the melodies are always at the service of the text. So if we want to say we are retaining the melodies for the sake of the melody, then we're missing something there. Because our our praise, our worship is always based on the text. That's what we have first. And if the melody obscures the text, then we have a problem. So sometimes I actually think original melodies might work better. And maybe even for people who are used to the Latin melodies, actually singing in an original melody for me would be less distracting in that sense.
But would it be an original melody that freely uses typical Gregorian phrases? I mean, it seems to me there's a whole spectrum here. You could keep the melody slavishly. You could keep it with careful adaptations like Father Samuel to make it fit. You could move motives around, and I've seen that it works well. You could just scratch, and I think Father Columba Kelly does this quite well, but you're freely drawing on what's there. Or you could say, English is not Latin, it's English, it's a Germanic language. I'm going to start with the rhythms of English, and I'm not even going to think I've ever heard Latin in my life, because it's going to come from the rhythm and the energy and even the consonants and the vowels of English. So I don't know, how far would you go, Audrey? And then I can tell you want to respond.
Really? Sorry, I am somewhat torn with this whole melody and English thing too. I think there's something to the beauty of hearing the same Latin melody over and over again, especially if we do the same, say, Advent introit. You know, every year on first Advent, everyone will have that melody in their heads. And it brings back, you know, me, the many, many years of celebrating liturgy with your family, so on and so forth. And when we come up with an original melody, we lose that. But then I'm more inclined to say, let's just do the Latin if we're going to try and do that. And antiphon of the same text with something that retains the English accents better and expresses that better.
Okay, Michael will respond to that, and then we'll move on to other pieces, but I want to hear what Michael says.
This touches a chord for me from having worked heavily with adapting Carpatho-Russian plain chant to English. I think Roman Catholics, there is a loss of understanding of the tripod, that a rite is text, the way the text is used, and then the melody. That's actually right.
Yeah, we lost that with the development of art music. You know, it was gone with Mozart or even 200 years earlier.
But I think even in the time of Mozart, you had a parallel track where you had plain chant and the plain chant and the contemporary
Now we
music.
only have and.
Unfortunately, yes. But what that does is it takes part of the rite. It takes the third leg of that stool and it collapses. You've lost a part of the heritage of the rite, that people should be able to walk into church and they hear, you know, it's Holy Thursday and you hear Ubi Caritas. It's the vigil of Easter and you hear the Exultet, or you hear the Easter Alleluia, or the dismissal Alleluia. When those things disappear, the rite is different. I really, it's that way. It's very much in Byzantine liturgy, because that part is enculturated. The Carpatho-Russians, they sing another way.
But it's integral to the rite.
Absolutely integral to the rite, and there's a sense of it's not Pascha if you're not singing this melody, is risen from the dead. You can use other melodies, and people do that. But especially for Carpatho-Russians, there's this sense of this is our chant. It's the prostopenia, the plain chant, is called Narodny pisan, people's chant, people singing. You take it away, you change it.
Of the way that tunes work still, it confirms what you're saying. So if we think the most obvious example would be Christmas tunes, of course, that everybody, it's just such an essential part of the feast, of the season, is singing these tunes. But also in terms of plain chant, we do have a few left. Veni Veni Emmanuel, Pange Lingua on Holy Thursday and Ubi Caritas on Holy Thursday. There are just a few that we have left, but I think it does speak to the residents talk about the tune being an essential part of the rite for everyone.
That it's, in the East they would say this is the canonical melody. Everything else is decoration. It's not bad, but it's not canonical.
And I think with, actually maybe we're in the Merovingian era of English chant, and maybe in 200 years we'll be in the Carolingian era, wonderful Graduale Romanum in English chant. Are all you chant geeks out there still with us? We're digging pretty deep here. There's an explosion of English chant going on now, and more of it is with some of the other examples that we now want to move to. And I'm really curious with whether we would sort of develop canonical English chant someday. And then, of course, there's the English as well. But I want to move on. So let's turn then to our next example. This would be the 4th page on your PDF out there. It would also be on your screen. And here Brother Elred is singing, and it's example number 3 on the top of the 4th page. And this is where Father Samuel is using, of course, the solemn psalm tone in mode 6. So let's give a listen.
Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, I in him, says the Lord.
So Father Samuel is really giving us a nice variety of things here, and we're only dipping in a little bit to hear 2 of them. So what do you think of this as a way to convey that proper text of the?
I like it. I think it's simple. This, as a communion antiphon, hopefully congregations can eventually join in if they hear this often enough. But yet there's enough ornamentation there to keep it. And play it off a psalm tone, so you're sort of just playing with those few tones. And I think that will eventually get into people's minds, them just enter into the song as well. I like that he has repercussions on me. I question the notation a little bit. Here he's using square notes and he has a vertical line on words that he wants slightly accented. I assume those would be lengthened a little bit. I would think an epizema would be better, or I would probably put it in 5-line notation if I were putting it in a worship aid.
Yeah, I don't think the vertical rhythmic. I think it meant something deeply spiritual and mystical, but sort of a stress of energy without lengthening. Yeah, but I'm surprised that anyone's using a vertical nowadays.
Did anybody else, I'd be curious, to me, looking at it when I first sang it and then looking at it ever since, whoever seems a little bit much to have two syllables, a little bit much. Felt like I lost a little bit of momentum moving towards each. I was wondering what everybody else, if you thought it.
Yeah, because actually Father Samuel here is following the given formula more than I would. I would just use those notes. I would feel free to break up the neumes or to connect them. So it could be, whoever eats my flesh. Okay, I see, that doesn't work. So that's the problem. He didn't have enough text to do that.
Something like, whoever eats
Yeah, I like that.
Just divide up Elizabeth a little differently.
I really like the use of the B flat on the word flesh too. I think that's a beautiful moment.
You know what Bruce Ford would do on this, anytime he adapts the English psalm tone the Latin psalm tone formulas to English, he changes it at the end when the English has, what it does over and over and over, is a big accent on that final syllable. So here it's flesh and drinks my blood. And that da-dum-dum, that dactyl, you lose blood. So he would change it to eats my flesh and drinks my blood. Now, when you know the formula, you go like that, but it does throw the to blood more appropriately. I have very mixed feelings about this.
It seems to me this kind of adaptation is very similar to the work that was in the Simple Gradual.
That's right.
You know, the adaptation of an office melody to be used in the Eucharist. And if you're going to have a congregational in a communion processional like this, these will work. I think the second one, whoever, works better for me than whoever. That's a little heavy at the beginning, but Seah does work.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a comment, Tim?
Yeah, just to go back to your question about the cadence. Flesh and drinks my blood. What would happen if we just brought blood back up to a G? Flesh and drinks my blood. Now that I sing it, I'm not sure I'm crazy about it.
Perfect, but not permitted because we're in mode 6. And
You're absolutely right.
the median
Thank you.
cadence has to end on F. You know, I don't speak for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but you know, there is that energy behind it, I think, for some people.
There we go. Well,
But we all smiled right away because we liked it melodically.
I think Horst smiled because he knew the mistake I was making.
I think one of the big problems is there are too many monosyllabic words in the English language.
Right.
And to adapt these Gregorian tones in language, which is anything but monosyllabic, that is just very difficult. I mean, you wrote about that in the Lumen Christi. Is it Christ is light? Yeah. Or just drop the pitch, or should we get more creative with that?
This is because even when I think a melody has been adapted successfully, and I think Bruce Ford does it the most like I would do it in his American Gradual for use in the Episcopal Church, still somehow it doesn't feel right to me because the whole style of melody feels like it fits a Romance language, and I think, well, why would that be? You know, why can't I in English have lots of melismas on syllables, but somehow it doesn't feel right. You're nodding. You feel the same way.
No, I agree with that. And I think the English language sometimes calls for a more simple musical approach. I mean, we kind of skipped the second example of Father Sam's, which I find probably more suitable in some ways and easier to follow the text. I mean, if you have too many notes on one syllable or one word, you still can't understand the text, although it is in English.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, though, the Americans fought that too, and you have Marbeck, you know, where you have one note per syllable.
Very spiritually dull for good spiritual
They got
reasons.
out of it very quickly because it, also because in most of the acoustics didn't work. Now, I think for a lot of people, there are a lot of churches that have no acoustic space. They're dead. And so they think that works better, but melismas sometimes are a challenge to the way that we think time.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're a challenge to say, slow down. You know, not to sing the melisma slower, but let this
Please
take.
don't.
No, please don't. Please. But let this entire thing take more time.
Well, and the other question, of course, which about it all, is who is singing this? I mean, in these elaborate antiphons, I mean, Father Sam certainly expects a cantor or choir to sing this, whereas the more simpler versions, I mean, are we talking about congregational antiphons or not? And I think when we look at some of the other examples that we have in our package here, we can, but Father Sam is forward, as does Adam Bartlett in his simple English propers. I mean, it's meant to sung by a cantor or a choir.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important distinction. But now I wonder, maybe we are in the Merovingian era of English chant and we're going to stay there because the English language cannot go Carolingian. Do you think? or will we have Carolingian melismas someday? Tim?
Saith the
Well, the idea of that Horst brought up of just the monosyllabic words, and you're wondering whether the English language would just be capable, is I was thinking about writing melodies and writing a great line, also a line of words, because I remember that Theodor Rutke, the poet, said it's easier to write a great poem than it is to write a great line. And I was just thinking through some great lines of poetry that I know, and I found that almost all of them that really in your head I wake to sleep and take my waking slow, or what will survive of us is love, or any of these one-liners that I can think of, very famous one-liners. I had so much trouble finding ones with lots of polysyllabic words. They all came out. It seemed like so many of the ones that stick in the English canon are monosyllabic. So I wonder if we are running into a boundary there.
Yeah, this is why I have to say I go back and forth on whether to sing psalm verses in English to Gregorian tones or just new tones from St. Meinrad. When I think about the English language, I think the Meinrad tones work better. But I don't want to lose it, so I keep using the Gregorian tones over and over and over because I want the church to use the Gregorian tones, and I keep adapting my theory of how to make it work. And do I go with a Bruce Ford, or am I more purist with a Samuel Weber? I'm still torn.
Well, I think these very simple English tones, like the Meinrad tones, they work if there are not too many words in one line.
That's
but if
right.
it's a very, very long line, that becomes a little bit too simplistic, perhaps.
I agree.
And in just the other way, that if the lines are too short, you cannot sing Gregorian tones.
That happened with the ISIL Psalter sometimes.
Yes.
Yep. Well, good. We have 4 examples yet to go through, so let's press on. We're now going to hear a piece by Father Columba Kelly, and again, a kind permission from OCP publication. His, as you'll see on the screen, the St. Meinrad entrance and communion antiphons for the church year. Same mode, same text, different melody.
Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him, says the Lord.
What do you think? I'm just going to open it up.
I think it sounds like many responsorial psalms, refrains. I think one thing...
Not sure, is that a compliment? I'm not sure. I shouldn't push you that way.
Actually, was there a value?
Is there?
Was it, you know...
We should let you finish.
Yeah, right.
But one thing which to all of us is, of course, we have a modern 5-line notation here, and we maybe for a second should just reflect on people who love chant, but are not really familiar in the 4-line Gregorian notation. And there are thousands out there. I mean, I've encountered so many qualified, well-trained musicians who say, well, I never learned how to read chant. And for these people, I think these 5-line versions of the antiphons are something that they would flock to first. Just a very practical, very important consideration.
Yeah, I agree. For cutting you off earlier.
No.
That's why, in my Canticum Novum side by side, so that people, I hope, will learn the 4-line, but if not, 5-line. If the 4-line is that much of a barrier, and I sort of think it isn't. You could learn it in 10 minutes, but 99% of the people don't believe me on that. So there you go. Melody itself.
I think the melody works well, and what I like about this is that it is its own melody, and it is something that you could potentially associate with this text and this particular ritual action, rather than adapting a psalm tone which could be used for multiple texts in the same context. This says it's a form for an antiphon in liturgy, communion. I think that works very well. I think the declamation worked rather well. It'd be easy to remember, learn. I think the 5-line notation is a real help, not just to music directors, but for many of us who work with largely amateur choirs or with a parish. I have a parish in northern Indiana that most people can read music, actually, but as soon as you put something 4-line in front of them, there's the mental block that says, I can't read this. And you fight that longer than you are trying to teach the music.
Mm-hmm. What do people think? Well, just the first 2 notes. And going up to a third, whoever.
It's saying a little bit tough for me. And I was wondering if it might not be easier just to begin with the FGF. I know I'm pushing for G's all day now. Whoever my flesh. I don't know. Whoever. It felt a little bit.
I like whoever better that way, but then it starts to sound like too much G.
Then we
and
start
too
to have
much
a lot of
wandering
G's,
around.
right?
I actually think he used the A there intentionally to accent the word ever, just that syllable. Whoever eats my flesh. So it's just a natural textual accent, and it works with a pitch that goes up naturally, and you don't actually have to put an epizeme or anything on it, and people would sing it that way.
I'd actually like to bounce off that too and say if you're singing this unaccompanied, it does help you to place the syllable rather nicely and still keep a good pace for the whole interpretation of the chant. Or if you're accompanying this, it seems very natural then to have a chord and a pickup. Whoever eats my flesh. It'll seem very natural if you're accompanying. I think it works rather well. It doesn't bother me actually at all.
Father Columba actually has accompaniments for this set, so now I'm curious to go look it up and see if he actually moves on that note.
Yes. One of the things that strikes me about this is that there's an awful lot of 3. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. And then you're out of it.
Yep.
But there is it feels to me just slightly unusual to have that much.
Yeah, I have found in writing simple English chant, and I do refer to this in what is the book I wrote for Lit Press? It's the Chants of the Roman Missal, and there's a scholarly introduction to explain the work of the ISO committee. I think English accents are so heavy that you can set up kind of a foxtrot if it's too many 2s, or you can set up a waltz if it's too many 3s. So you almost have to purposely break it up somehow without breaking it up by throwing in a note that's just filler.
Right.
That makes it wander around aimlessly. It's actually quite challenging to get it right.
And without having too many melismas, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But then I think this is one of the questions we have to ask ourselves when setting English texts and trying to have some sort of chant. Is this one of the maybe costs of doing it, that we may end up with something that feels in a sense of 3 because that fits the language well, in a sense of 2 because that fits the language well? That may be one of the costs.
In the collection of entrance and communion antiphons that Father Columba did, there's the antiphon itself, and then there is a small refrain that can be given to the congregation. That's not a new idea to him. The Einheitsgesangbuch in Germany in the 70s had things structured with what I would call the antiphon, the Kehrvers.
Yep.
And then the antiphon was a Chorstrophe, and then there was a Kehrvers that was given to the assembly. So it's that same principle.
Yeah, it's nice, I think.
If the communions have that, but he does it with all of the entrance antiphons.
Yeah, and I would just bring up you're bringing up a point that we've mentioned again, that who's singing to be that it would work so well for a congregation. That sense of easy 3s helps it to be memorized very quickly and learned very quickly and feel very comfortable, I think, if you have a congregation that has one time of listening to learn it.
And going back to what you talked about, the whole 3s and the waltzing, if this is for a congregation, I don't think that's much of a problem because they are in procession, and that may actually help them enter and remember the chant more easily if they had that beat going.
But doesn't that become an argument then to use solite instead of plain song if a steady beat is what helps to draw people?
I would say too.
Okay.
Let's just mix things up.
Well, the question is, of course, we agree that this is something that the congregation can sing, right? But who is singing? The people in procession? The people who have received? The people who are still seated? So just think about that. You need to answer that. But if you want people to sing in procession, it must be so simple that they don't need to take a book.
Right. That's right.
So the melody can't have too many changes and turns. So the memorable at the second, third hearing or so. They can sing that basically from memory.
Yeah, so the danger is that the people are singing only in the church documents, because they do there. We need to move on. And let's listen to Adam Bartlett's setting of the from the Simple English Propers.
Eats my flesh and drinks my blood, abides in me, and I in him, says the Lord.
This is a totally new melody, but it feels so Gregorian. Horst?
Ubi caritas et
I wonder if that's
amor.
intentional.
It just much the same and ends on that soul. That's why I was thinking about that immediately
It's a
when I heard that.
Eucharistic text.
I'd like to point out that Ubi Caritas is public domain at this point.
Okay.
It's okay. Steal from the right place. Is this a good melody, Tim?
I liked it very much. I like it very much. I also noticed that the B flat, which is, I don't know how to, it's the most, I think. It only occurs twice, and it's the highest note. And he uses it on two relatively unimportant words, or words that you wouldn't look for immediately. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood. Using it on and then in. And this reminds me of something that you're often saying, Father Anthony, is that often the melodies will bring attention to important words, but at other times they bring attention to unimportant words. And we're left wondering why, sometimes for a particular effect, sometimes just, I don't know. I think it's beautiful melodic writing, though.
I think it's important to realize that you don't want to impose the ethos of the art song on monody. And we have that in Eastern chant as well, where people tried to transcribe it, and when there was a note that was higher, they put, and it's like, even in Slavonic, that higher note was like it's an upper neighbor tone. And here you can see that he goes, he eats my flesh and drinks it. So because of the way it's approached and resolved, that's not the center.
No, I agree. B flat points you to the A that follows, and the A has such magnetic force that I feel that the text is treated well. Does anyone find that there's too much, I'm playing devil's advocate, too much A in this antiphon, or rather is that, no, that's how mode 6 behaves? You're okay with it?
It didn't really bother me
No?
at all.
Okay.
I actually like to make a comment here, though, that, well, I actually very much agree with you with the B flat, that it sets up the cadence that follows so nicely rather than drawing attention to itself. It's a good use of a high note to point out something that follows rather than draw attention to itself. I would say with this, just looking at it, I think Adam's notation maybe betrays him a little bit, that he has this lovely melody that I think could work rather nicely for a choir. It may even be something after time that a congregation could learn if they hear it regularly with relative ease, I think. But looking at it, it seems to be these set of blocks, and clearly when you sing it, it's not. And I wonder if there's a way he could more clearly indicate where phrases are going, groups work together, where the punctuation marks are in the music.
Actually, the notation it gives me a place to trip. I don't understand the use of the breath mark. Because for example, the problem is we have them in the Latin books, but they're very rare. And here, I don't know, do I want to treat that like, and I in hymns. There's a break, but there was no sense of hymn.
Which I feel like it should be with
Yes,
that.
I do too.
Yeah, okay.
And not a breath, because you don't need a breath there. I think when you
Yeah,
take
I
a
think I
breath,
agree there
it
too.
actually destroys the line.
Yep. For all of that, can I say this? I think Adam Bartlett is just a really fine composer. I
Amen.
think Simple English Propers were perfect, and now the Lumen Christi Missal is even more perfect. I just think his treatment of modality is right on.
I'd like to point out the cadence on.
Okay.
There was a reason I loved this one.
All right, we'll give you that.
I would like to say also, I think one thing that makes this melody so successful is the kind of contrast of the pairings of twos and threes. That it's not all just pairs of threes or all just pairs of twos, that he subtly moves between these pairs of twos and threes that makes the text propel forward. It helps the melody be memorable. It keeps the syntax of the text very clear. It works well for the English language.
I can say one more thing. Marks, says the Lord. This is the only time he drops down to the D. Another really nice touch.
Yeah, it's just, I think,
Of that D there.
for sure.
Oh.
Better than
Yeah.
And a very Gregorian thing, though. It's not
Absolutely.
new. It's not something we don't do in mode 6. We do. But I often say to myself, be very careful about criticizing out of context. If you sing, abides in me and I in him, or him, and then you are not going to take a breath at the first chord. You do sort of need the breath to, or make a distinction with the says the Lord. I wanted to at least give it that kind of credit, but I wish, I think, that he'd used another quarter bar. It just the breath mark, unless it's in his, if somebody's put it in their preface, and I haven't seen the preface, so.
Okay, I think we can move on to our final example from John Ainsley, and the collection just came out from the Liturgical Press, English Proper Chant. Same text, same mode, different melody.
Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him, says the Lord.
Let the free for
I like the use of these liquescent notes there in the 5-line notation. I actually want to know what font that is, because mine does not.
Oh, finale does. You just, and I don't know if it is finale, I suspect it might be. You just click on the little percent sign on the note.
On one note,
Yeah.
you can reduce
And then
that.
you can
Oh,
put
okay.
it any percent you
I've
want.
seen that before.
And again, if explained in the foreword, that's, for example, there is no explanation in the Roman Missal about how to interpret the English chant. And if you don't have the background of the Latin chant, you're going to do it wrong.
Yeah.
So, but what that liquiescent means, it's a very good thing, because then you're not going to get misaccents.
How do you like the melody, folks?
I bet Tim likes ending on a G there, that phrase.
Well, I'm going to let you talk about that, Caleb.
I think the melody works rather well. It seems, to my ear and my taste, perhaps, that he's moving less from modal composition, more towards something that resembles tonality in a more direct way, which he uses well here to great effect. But I think maybe he could play with the mode a little more, stay in it a little bit longer.
Actually, I could go either way on that. This one for me stands out. It's not modal and it's not Gregorian, and you could say, so therefore it's chant and it doesn't, meet the bar.
Well,
or you could say it's because it sounds English and it sounds like the English language, and it's not trying to be a romance melody.
I just want to point out that the Mass 8 Gloria is in D major.
Well, the Mass 8, that's a 13th century Kyrie. The creed's from the 16th century, so it's not that Gregorian either.
Yeah. So, modality is modality how we define chant. I guess that's what I'm trying to put out there.
There you go.
It's again one
Horst?
of the cost questions, I think.
Yeah.
How do you all feel about the second line? This remains in me and I in him. That kind of really sinks into the another world there a little bit. Does that express the text particularly well, or what do you feel? Or it doesn't bother you?
I think you could argue that it does. Remains in and I in him. There's a certain restfulness to it. There's a certain going from D da 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 do. which is nice. That said, I probably wouldn't. Yeah. So
You probably would not have written
I
that?
probably would not have written it that way. And I can't quite say why. Again, melody is difficult to talk about, but yeah, I noticed that as well. It didn't sing so easy to me.
For me, I tend to approach anything like this with how am I going to teach it, and how are other people going to teach it. Remains in me and I in him is an obvious phrase, but I can see a lot of people breathing after me.
And that would kill it.
It would become it would take a line and make it very heavy. So that is always the danger for any of us or transcribe, is that once it's out of our hands, we don't control how it's going to be performed. But you can be aware of what traps you're laying for people.
Audrey, is this a good melody? I'm putting you on the spot.
I think it's okay. It doesn't wow me, to be honest. What I like about it, I think it's actually because it's, I think it's very usable. If your parish has never ever done chant before, I want them to get a sense of what it's like to hear free rhythm, and for text and melody to come together such that the music is serving the text as priority. I think this is a really good way to introduce them to it. And hopefully they'll just catch on. And when you work with cantors who are leading this chant, they need to model it well, and that's where they can, not have to worry about fidelity and getting that right. If it's a sound that they're not used to, it may be hard for them sometimes, but because this is so modern sounding, they can just plunge right in, and then we can work on textual accents rather than melody.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I would say that he does seem to use, again, maybe something that's a little bit more tonal, but adds a level of comfort, especially if this is a new sound world that your parish choir is entering into, your congregation is entering into. He does kind of use these structural points, right? So the first phrase ends on the second degree of the scale, so you have kind of a pause. The second phrase ends on something that could essentially end the antiphon, so it has a sense of finality, and then you have the quotation marks, which uses the sixth scale degree going back to the first.
So his modality is syntactic.
I would say it is. It seems to be. It seems too intentional to not be syntactical, but it is a useful tool. Even if to maybe our ears, or at least to my ears, I'll take credit for this just to myself, that it loses a sense of the modality, the punctuation and the clarity of structure seems to be an intentional tool he's working with here.
I'm actually coming to like the Ainsley more and more as I think about it for what it is, and not against the backdrop of, is it chant like all of the others? I would now say it's not, and because of that, there's something very fresh about it. And it helps me to hear the text in a new way, because it does sound so right for the English language.
Please permit me to quibble with you just in the terms of using the word chant.
Okay.
I think a lot of people, for example, I've used Gregorian melodies in English and then been told by somebody, but why don't we sing chant? And then I asked, okay, wait a minute, you've got to define that for me. And then I found out that chant can only be in Latin. That was their understanding. My understanding is that chant is a style. And so Gregorian in English, or Gregorian auf Deutsch, or, which are the only two that I know, okay, aside from Latin, that those are equally part of they're using the third leg of the stool. But chant, if I'm just using chant, it doesn't mean to me Gregorian chant. So this is chant to me. It's not Gregorianic, but it's chant.
Thank you for that quibble. That's my ecclesiology perfectly. I think we're nearing the end of our hour, so we have to stop there. But boy, wasn't this is my time. I'm not sure what that says about my social life as a monk, but this is a good time. Thank you, all of you. Caleb, Timothy, Horst, Audrey, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.